Hello, and welcome to our webinar today, which is part of the first ever Conflict Avoidance Week in the UK. And I'm pleased to see that we have an audience from beyond the shores of the UK, and perhaps understandably so, because the ideas, the principles behind conflict avoidance, real-time dispute prevention, are rightly recognised as being an important part of any construction project. And I think the advantages of conflict avoidance apply wherever you are. And our speakers too. That reflects the global importance of conflict avoidance. Georgiana Tăcuci from Romania, President of Region 2 of the DRBF, passionate supporter of dispute boards, works regularly with government organisations and funding agencies. Andrew Allenby, head of the UK branch of the DRBF, mediator, arbitrator, owned his own firm for over 10 years. Sean Greer, independent arbitrator, dispute board practitioner, extensive practice in the Caribbean and beyond, passionate as we all are about the value of education. Lindy Patterson KC, recognised as a go-to arbitrator, dispute board member, simply described in her directories as being extremely impressive. To be fair, those two words I know apply equally to all of our speakers today. So briefly, conflict avoidance, what is it? Well, back in 2018, a small group of organisations got together, the DRBF was one, and they set up the Conflict Avoidance Coalition, the Conflict Avoidance Steering Group. And the basic, you may say, obvious aims and ideals of the organisation was to see how they could promote conflict avoidance, see how they could find alternative ways to avoid ending up in litigation or arbitration. Perhaps some 18 months ago, there were around 100 organisations, individuals who were members of the Conflict Avoidance Coalition. Today, those numbers are over 500, and they include government agencies, tier one contractors, suppliers, engineers, companies, and individuals, wide range of groups across the entire construction spectrum. And I think that's a testament to the value today that everyone sees and puts on conflict avoidance. And we'll be looking in our discussion today a little bit more deeply about what conflict avoidance is all about. But I think just to begin with, something that's actually particularly important is that conflict avoidance is recommended by the government in their construction playbook, the government procurement rules for government practices, projects. They say the conflict avoidance pledge demonstrates commitment to conflict avoidance, commitment to the use of amicable dispute resolution procedures, dealing with emerging disputes at an early stage, preventing disputes from becoming disputes. The government advised that contracting authorities should adopt conflict avoidance provisions as a standard clause in all public works contracts. And those provisions can come from a wide variety of clauses. They could include, for example, early warning, including obligations for parties to identify and communicate problems early on, and include a commitment to achieving quick and amicable resolution. That's what conflict avoidance is all about. But the construction playbook also says this: dispute avoidance boards are a potential way to avoid and manage disputes more effectively, and where appropriate, they should be engaged with projects from inception to completion. So the UK government recommends the use of dispute avoidance boards as well. And that's particularly apposite today in 2025, because 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of the use of the first dispute review board in Colorado in the United States. And this first board, it was used in the second bore of the Eisenhower Tunnel in Colorado. And the first bore was, as you can see on the text, was a complete financial disaster. The participants and the construction project were determined not to get burnt again, and they set up a review board. It consisted of two engineers and one lawyer, and the words on the screen are the words of the lawyer, Palmer King. And the second bore of the tunnel was much more successful. There were claims in excess of 50 million US dollars on the first project. The second one, where there was a dispute board, well, there were hardly any claims at all. by the time the project had finished, I think there were 2 or 3 in the value of a few $100,000. So having a review board was an instant and proven success. And there's recently been some research, as many of you will know, from King's College London. Their report came out in December of last year. You'll see that they looked into 6 years of dispute board practice. They carried out research over 12 months. There were 213 respondents. And importantly, the respondents were individuals, users of dispute boards, but also funders, project owners, a wide spectrum across the use of dispute boards. And they looked into over 4,000 dispute boards. And Sir Vivian Ramsey, at the launch of the report, commented that the value of this survey was that it allowed reliable data to be collected on all topics in relation to dispute boards, until now, just with a few exceptions, only anecdotal evidence. The comments about the Eisenhower Tunnel, although showing the spectacular turnaround once the dispute review board was being used, would probably fall into anecdotal evidence. There isn't time today to go through the entirety of the report, but just to pick out 1 or 2 key findings. How often were decisions or recommendations from dispute boards referred to litigation or arbitration? Well, the answer's not very often at all. Between 0 and 10% of the time tended to be the answer that people gave. And if a decision or recommendation was referred to court or arbitration, how often was the decision actually reversed? Well, most respondents, about 80% of them, said rarely or never. And that's interesting because it confirms some earlier research carried out by the DLBF, by Leo Gruters and Jeff Smith, who looked into dispute boards up until around 2016, 2018. And they asked similar questions. And they looked at 512 decisions. Most of them, 338, were immediately complied with. Only 32, 6%, were referred to arbitration. And of those, only 7, 1.37%, were actually overturned. In almost all the cases they looked at, the original decision or recommendation from the dispute board was honoured or found to be correct. Now, one of the reasons often put forward for not using dispute boards is the cost. Well, King's had a look at the cost too. And almost all of the dispute boards, the average cost of a dispute board was under 1% of the total cost of the project. And again, that mirrored the research from Jeff Smith and Leo Gruters. It also mirrored the research from the Florida Department of Transport. In 2013, they looked at 750 of their projects, and the total cost came at 0.1%. And the Florida research is interesting for another reason, because Florida had some projects where they used a dispute board, and they had some projects where no dispute board was used. So they compared the difference. For those projects where a dispute board was being used, the time overrun was about 1.8%. Whereas when there was no dispute board, the time overrun was almost 20%. With the cost overrun, with a dispute board, 12%. Without a dispute board, 18%. Real project evidence of the value of using a dispute board in helping to avoid disputes. And the result was today, Florida decided to use the process for almost all their projects. And the King's report also looked at dispute avoidance. I looked to see how often dispute avoidance measures were adopted. And the answer was about 50% of the time, 25% of the time always adopted, 25% of the time very often adopted. And I think the answer there, one of the reasons why having a week like Conflict Avoidance Week is so important, gives us the opportunity to discuss with everyone what the potential value of dispute avoidance or conflict avoidance might be. But interestingly, King's then went on to look at the results of the adoption of the avoidance measures. And you'll see that almost 50% of the time, the dispute was completely avoided. And almost 40% of the time, the scope of the dispute was significantly reduced. So I think those clear figures demonstrate the value to the parties of adopting conflict avoidance or dispute avoidance measures. And equally, they mirror the previous DRBF research for the period up to 2018. There was party satisfaction when dispute avoidance was actually being used. Again, dispute avoidance was only being used about 55% of the time, but when it was being used, parties were very satisfied with the results. But just before we start our discussion, to go back to the work of the Conflict Avoidance Coalition, one of the first things that the original founders of the Conflict Avoidance Coalition, including the DRBF, did was they drafted a conflict avoidance toolkit. And there are like 5 principles. What should you be doing if you are adopting conflict avoidance? Well, the first one, pre-contract, the importance of thorough preparation of project documentation, the importance of appropriate risk allocation, the importance of ensuring that the contract makes sense, the contract is totally joined up. And then if you look at the other 4 items, dispute avoidance, using early warning systems to identify potential conflict and prevent disputes from occurring, early intervention, adopting procedures to fix problems and enable them to remain control of decisions, amicable settlement, look for mediative method to help resolve the dispute, something that's private, something not adversarial. And then dispute resolution. Well, if you're going to resolve your dispute, go for a final determination dispute that's quicker and cheaper than the courts and arbitration. Now, many of you, and certainly myself personally, I think that you'll find many of the attributes of a good dispute board in that conflict avoidance toolkit. The things that you want your dispute board to be doing, they're clearly there as part of that toolkit. But that was just a brief introduction to some of the values of conflict avoidance, the conflict avoidance pledge, the conflict avoidance toolkit in the UK. But that's probably enough for me for today. But one of the things that I've been talking about in the slides is dispute avoidance. And I think one of the interesting and to some people difficult things about dispute avoidance, when we talk about dispute avoidance, when we talk about conflict avoidance, is what is it? And more particularly, how does a dispute board practice dispute avoidance? I wonder, Lindy, if you have any comments on that.
Yes, I think it's an important one because we talk about dispute avoidance a lot. And the question is, how does a dispute board go about practicing it? And by raising that question, I don't just mean through informal opinion, which is obviously embedded in the contract, but how does the dispute board set the environment or scheme to enable parties and the board to work together in a way that will avoid disputes? That, to me, is key for a standing board. And I do have some great examples, I think, of how that can work. What's important, obviously, is you will very often have one party to the dispute board who is much less willing to participate in the process. And I think as the dispute board, it's down to us to make them realise that this is a dispute board for the project, not for one or other party. And to that end, I think the dispute board can help. Equally, in my experience, it enables parties to communicate sometimes in a way that they've not been able to together, but they want to keep on the right side of the dispute board, so maybe much more cooperative. I don't know what the other panelists think about that.
Shan?
Yeah, no, I think, Lindy, you make a valuable point, and I think it's for us as a dispute board to navigate the process in a way that instills that confidence. I think very often We know that the data shows that dispute board works, but there is a general resistance to disputes. But I think that happens across the board internationally, not just in the UK. And I think one of the difficulties is very often the parties see dispute boards as an added layer of bureaucracy in an industry that already is burdened by bureaucracy. And they also see an added level of accountability. And that can make parties uncomfortable, not necessarily because they don't want to be accountable, but I think you're in an industry where you're not just looking at, the bricks and mortar issues, but what I call the 2 Ps, politics and personalities, particularly on large infrastructure projects. And what's critical is not just what they need to communicate, but how, when, and whom. And so they're navigating all of this, how, well, and whom, and then they see this dispute board. This is another person that I have to figure out how to politically correctly say something in a way that doesn't create additional problems. And I think it's how we can provide true value. It lies in our ability to sort of go beyond the words and use our experience to sort of figure out what do we think that's actually happening here, and trying to craft solutions in a diplomatic way as possible so that we are not seen as an added burden. And that we're seen as a pathway to a resolution. And in that way, I think we'll be seen more as an asset and than an obstacle. And so, Lindy, I agree with you. It's the communication that's going to get us there.
It's sort of hearts and minds, isn't it? Initially, it's winning them over to really believe that we can add value, which I do believe we can, but convincing them, especially very senior people in the organisations, as you say, may be slightly suspicious of it and not be keen on that level of oversight.
Andrew?
Two points, actually. The first is there a difference between a standing board, which is there, 4 times a year for the duration of the project, which I think is what we've been talking about, or an ad hoc board, which is just constituted to deal with one dispute, and quite often that's at a late stage where the dispute quite entrenched on both sides, and it's almost a mini arbitration rather than something which is hearts and minds. And I'd love to hear more from Lindy on that. The other thing is that there's sometimes, you've got the strangers coming in and wandering around the site, particularly on the first visit. What do they know? Why should you listen to them? And there was a question on the chat actually about sometimes DBs pass time and they're interested in field visits and monthly remuneration. And I suppose my immediate thought on that is, if you want them to make informed comment, they actually need to know something about the project. In a perfect world, they wouldn't say anything. There'd be no disputes, there'd be nothing for them to do. But there aren't many projects which are actually like that. And so it is an investment that really is made at the beginning, and you decide to make it at the beginning. So those were my comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really important points. On the ad hoc board, of course, we don't really get given a remit to do conflict avoidance. And I did actually have a situation where we were a standing board in a situation, but one of the parties was not prepared to give us the conflict avoidance role. So although we were a standing board and attended quite regular meetings, I think it was 3 a year, one of the parties just was not prepared to take it any further. And for me, that was something that I felt we really needed to try to win them over, because the great advantage, of course, of a standing board is that you can give that added value. As far as the second point is concerned about what does the dispute board know, certainly I think for most people, the first dispute board meeting, which hopefully will be very early on in the project, should be the one where the scene is set, the dispute board is given some background explanations, and then hopefully the dispute board will be given enough information as it progresses with reference to minutes of meetings, etc., just to keep on top of it without wasting too much time. Because I agree, there is no point in a dispute board having a site meeting when all they're interested in is a particular type of engineering that they may be interested in, but parties don't really feel the need to share it. So there are, I accept there are issues there, but hopefully a dispute board can work with parties so that they really do have a comfortable relationship there.
I mean, it was interesting, Andrew. You you made the comment. You know, sometimes the dispute board ideally has nothing to do, and I think that was one of the points that Palmer King made in relation to the very first dispute board. Well, we didn't really have that much to do for the first year or so, but in fact, they were doing quite a lot just by their presence, because they were set up at the beginning of the project. They were there for a reason, because the parties had identified they wanted to do things differently, and they were having the regular site visit, the site meeting minute. They would come to the site every 2 or 3 months, so they weren't quite doing nothing, but their presence was helping to aid a sort of way of behaviour. I mean, of course, the parties were desperate to avoid what had happened before. But the dispute board, although it looked like they weren't doing anything in the sense that they weren't making formal decisions, there was a change. They were helping to set the tone for the project. They were helping to instigate a change in what had gone before, presumably, and I don't want to put words into the mouths of people from a long time ago. You know, they're helping the parties communicate and deal with things in a different way. Georgiana, I don't know if there's anything.
Well, to Lindy's point, the dispute board adds value, and to Ken's point, how to deal with a new person in the politics. I think that the whole relationship should be considered at the point of selection of your dispute board members, because if you select someone, you get to know through CV first, and then through the interviews, you start trusting them from the moment you do first contact. So little by little, you build it up, and you add up layer by layer of trust by discussion and getting confidence in what they say and how they react. And I also think that part of cultural background or cultural awareness is very important as well. Knowing how to adapt to the particular country, region, and backgrounds of all those people involved in, whether employers or owners or contractors or engineers. And to the point that Andrew was saying, you know, getting back to the ad hoc and standing, perhaps all this movement of the activists pushing towards a standing dispute board, it helps people change the mentality as well, seeing that, you know, at the beginning, no one likes change, and you're forced to do something. So once you're forced to do something, maybe if you do it right and you have the good results, then you start adopting it. But anything else is difficult to adopt change.
And Jeremy, if I could just make a point
please.
to address the point that was raised in the chat, because when you're working in the Caribbean, you're in an area where it's considered a paradise. And there is this general disgruntled sentiment by people at the point that the DABs are really coming for their holidays. And I remember being on a board, and one of the dispute boards came in from Europe. And while he was there, he was talking, yeah, I brought my wife with me and my kids, and I'm going to be staying for a few days. You know, and I just kept thinking, even if you did that, probably best not to say it, because the perception is this is really a holiday, or you have an excuse to go somewhere different. And certainly on that particular project, we saw that they were not happy because there was a substantive cost to bringing 3 dispute board members to the site. And what we did was at the end of every dispute board meeting, with the first one we did in person, and then after that we'd have a list of, look, what do we think the issues are going to be? And then the second one we'd say, all right, we're going to do this one virtually. And then if there were any things we need to see on site, they do it. And then we do the next one in person. And we didn't, so we had site visits, but they weren't necessarily all in person. And I think that sort of garnered some trust with the parties, because they didn't feel that we were just coming for coming's sake and just looking around, you know, and clocking fees, as it were. So I think the technology is such that we can use that to try and make the dispute boards a little more cost effective, and have the parties put a little more trust in the process.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I've certainly been involved in a board where there's been a mix of on-site visits and virtual site meetings, because they were the virtual meetings worked well. You didn't need to go to the site all the time, and it dealt with that unease as to why people might be going to the site. But I mean, there's a comment being made in the chat about, you know, the importance of site visits to enable the parties to gauge what's happening on site, first-hand viewing of the problem, and also gauging the atmosphere and the relationships between the parties. So I think there's a need for mix, but also I think, Sian, as you said, there seems to be some care was being taken on what are the potential issues. Are they issues that can be resolved through a virtual discussion, or do we actually need to go to site and sort of look at things each hand? I mean, it's important to be sort of engaged, being informed by the parties, and so being able to get a good relationship with the parties. I don't know, Lindy, if you've got any other comment you would make.
No, I mean, I think we're all on the same page, and the question always is how you go about it. How do you go about earning the trust of the parties? Everyone has their own style, but it is somehow persuading them that they're all part of it, and that, for example, the engineer is not going to be scrutinized in an extremely critical way, you know, that sort of thing. Because very often you will turn up at the first meeting and you will sense that some individuals are seriously concerned about your involvement. So it's how you overcome that, because if you set the scene that way, I think success follows, but you know, it can be a challenge sometimes.
Okay. We've got to, just while we're on the sort of topic of sort of dispute boards on site, there've been a couple of comments that have come in the chat, and one asking about dispute boards enjoying the hospitality of the parties. I think quite often, or certainly in my experience, you go to a site and quite often you're staying on the site, and so the way you have to live with the site, and so you are sharing the hospitality of your hosts, which, you know, but it has to be done carefully in the way that you do it. I don't know, Lindy, Sian, your experience of sort of being on site and with, you know, how you deal with sort of liaising with the parties outside of the actual mechanics of the visit or a site meeting.
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky, and for example, we had a situation where the board had to be given transport to site, and there was a big debate about who was going to give them a lift and who was going to be in the car, etc. So we mustn't underplay these. I guess really I try to avoid at all costs being on my own with one of the parties. What I would say is that many parties are very aware of it. I think it is nice if you can to have lunch or whatever, or dinner with them, but provided it is with everyone.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it needs to be with everyone. It can be part of the getting to know the individuals, being able to understand. Perhaps it can be a way of improving communication between the parties, but I think it needs to be done carefully. There's also comment, I think, perhaps made in response to something you said, Sian. Why was there a need to bring in people from Europe? Why not have DB members from the Caribbean? And I think that's a comment that could have come from someone in Asia or someone in other parts of the world. But I don't know if you have any comments in relation to that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that certainly this year we're looking to work with the DRBF on. I think one of the challenges we have when you're in smaller regions is that you don't have a framework that exists, and so there's a struggle to find the persons. So not necessarily that there aren't dispute board members in the region, it's just that it's a little difficult to find them. And so we want to work to sort, and also a lot of the DRBF members aren't registered with international organizations, or they aren't on the FIDIC list. And so then you find we tend to lean to the persons who are on these lists, which tend to be from Europe. So that's one of the reasons why that happens. But certainly it's something that we need to work on.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the reasons I stress the value of education in the introduction. We've had another question, and I confess I'm not entirely sure that I know the answer to this. Someone's been asking about the differences between conflict avoidance and dispute avoidance. I have a feeling I tend to use the two interchangeably, and I think that they broadly mean the same thing. I suppose dispute avoidance has certain connotations with the FIDIC form of contract, but I don't know if anyone has any comments or views themselves. Georgiana, perhaps? Sorry.
Okay. Well, I tend to look at them in the same way. Though sometimes I heard people referring to conflict avoidance as before a dispute crystallizes, and then consider dispute avoidance before you go actually into the next stage. I heard, but I think it depends of a lot of to whom you talk to, the type of contract you work within. You know, if English is not your first language, again, could have an impact on words. So all the time, be careful on the terminology you tend to use. But
yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I've started using conflict avoidance more because I'm aware of the work of the Conflict Avoidance Coalition. So from a UK point of view, I think it feels more comfortable to use it on that stage. But both, and with FIDIC, the danger for FIDIC users is you talk about dispute avoidance and you focus on informal opinions, and whereas in fact FIDIC it's much broader, and they actually mean, I'm going to say it, dispute avoidance in the conflict avoidance sense, in trying to prevent issues becoming disputes in the first place. I've heard people talk about stamping on the embers before they become flames. So it's difficult. In one sense, I don't think there's much of a difference between them. And what everybody who's practicing conflict or dispute avoidance is wanting to do is stop there being conflict or avoidance in the first place.
there is.
I have found there. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Georgiana.
Thank you. Mediation-wise, conflict tends to be seen more as a long-term, where the dispute like a temporary thing that could be solved faster. That's the only difference that I
Okay, Sean.
Yeah, I was going to say that I find in the civil law jurisdictions, particularly the Dutch, they have a very adverse reaction to the word dispute unless it's an actual dispute, to the point where if they're talking about an issue that exists and you say, oh, are there any disputes? They will say, no, there's no disputes. It's an issue, to the point we had to call them issues because they felt very uncomfortable with the use of that word. Because as far as they're concerned, that means that, we're off to the races. And so I think conflict avoidance says, look, there is something that we're working out and, we're trying to have a discussion. That's a conflict. When you say the word dispute, it means that we have tried to resolve it and we can't. And now a formal process has to be triggered.
Yeah, nice. Moving on a little bit, one of the things in my introduction, I referred to the construction playbook in the UK and sort of called it the sort of government rules for procurement. One of the, as I said, one of the things they recommended was the use of a dispute avoidance board. My experience is that dispute boards aren't used that much in the UK or at all. I mean, there are one or two examples. And I was wondering, if my understanding was correct, why that was. I don't know, Andrew, whether there's something you thought about.
Funnily enough, since you asked me to think about it last week, I have. And
Not so.
I'd agree with you. I don't know really of any active ones. Occasionally we send out questionnaires saying, anyone know of any dispute boards in the UK? And we don't really get positive responses. So the simple answer for why they're not used is that there's a statutory adjudication process in England and Wales. There are equivalents in the other UK jurisdictions as well. And let's call it the Construction Act. It's a security for payment, quite well-known approach to making claims, particularly for money, under any construction project. And it's compulsory. You can't really contract out of it. It's also a 28-day process, extendable, but only by agreement or for a little bit. So it's pretty quick. And that's just used all the time. And it's sort of destroyed domestic construction arbitration. There isn't much of that. There was a lot when I started, but there isn't much now. And so it's familiar and it kind of works. I suppose what that does, though, is concentrate on the adjudication part of dispute adjudication boards, and it doesn't really capture the useful advisory role that we've just been talking about, the enhancing of communication and trying to address all of those things early between the parties. You know, it waits until there is a dispute and it says, right, we can solve that in 28 days. And of course, it's a 28-day process. You don't get the detailed examination of other things that you underlying things, you know, all of the documents, all of the arguments that you would get in a much longer process. You know, even the FIDIC process is 84 days. So I think that's the main reason. And if you want something else, if you want the parties to talk to each other, there are other processes which are known about. I'm not sure that I know how often they're used, like panels set up for particular projects, which exist and you can use them. The UK does a lot of mediation. Again, that maybe that's gone beyond a little conflict and more towards a formal dispute, just picking up on what was a useful distinction. There is the possibility of using dispute boards in the UK, even though there is a mandatory adjudication process, because you can adapt the contract provisions. You can adapt FIDIC if you want to. In 2021, the JCT, the Joint Contracts Tribunal, who published a very well-known standard form of contract here, they drafted something which can apply in the UK and elsewhere to comply with the mandatory requirements of the Construction Act. And they did that in collaboration with the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. And they did it saying that it was for use for bigger projects, for higher budget, longer lasting projects, because I think they recognize there's a cost of putting those in place, which is not appropriate for some smaller projects with smaller value disputes. So they said this complies with the statutory requirements for adjudication. It captures recommendations and informal advice. the JCT scheme captures those things. So it captures long-term involvement of the dispute board, visits, informal advice, recommendations, and also adjudication. And it's got some cautions in there, like, for example, not learning information privately from one party in the early parts of that, so that you're not unfairly prejudiced in a later dispute about the same thing. So it's possible in the UK, and I think probably the reason it's not used is it's not habitual, and it's got other things which kind of do adjacent jobs. They don't do exactly the same job on the early advice and the early intervention, though.
Okay, brilliant. Sian, what's the situation in the Caribbean? I mean, you talked about some dispute boards.
Yeah, and so in the early part of my career, I worked in England, at London, to be more precise, as a construction lawyer. And so I've had the experience of doing adjudication where there's a statutory framework, and I'm an advocate of it. It works well. And they have attempted to use this adjudication, both in the Caribbean and in other regions where there aren't, they don't have that regulatory framework. And it doesn't work as well, particularly when you have 28 days and you know that you don't know if it's going to be enforced because there's no regulation to enforce it, and you don't have a set procedure or default procedure. And I've had adjudications where I've spent 14 days trying to determine whether or not the 28 days meets the due process provisions in the civil code. And I mean, intellectually, that's fascinating to me. But to the clients, it's frustrating because that's not what they paid for. They're not interested in whether, this provision applies. They just want to get to the dispute. And so I'm an advocate of the adjudication process, and I wouldn't think that England should throw that away. Having said that, I agree with Andrew. There is the conflict avoidance part of the DAB, which can provide value. And I don't think we should dismiss that either. And what I'm going to say is a bit cliche, and I think that certainly our Caribbean Development Bank has attempted to do it. But, instead of having sort of the midnight clause bespoke provisions, we need to start thinking about whether we can have provisions with mixed provision, both for adjudication and conflict avoidance, and having clauses that take into account the fact that England has a robust adjudication process, and drafting clauses that deal with the conflict, try to fit the conflict prevention part into that clause so that they can sit well together. Or I guess we could do it the other way, which is to turn the DAB clause into a provision that is compliant with the adjudication rules. Either way, I think it requires some thinking to ensure that we're giving the users what it is that they require in the different jurisdictions. And that's going to change depending on where you are.
Yeah. Georgiana, I know you don't have adjudication in Romania, but you are on mute, I'm afraid.
Every now and then have a problem with it. No, we don't. But in terms of enforcement, we did find a solution, as in going to arbitration and saying this is a contractual obligation. Parties have agreed to observe the decision of the dispute board, even if it's unless and until you have agreed to abide to it. So from our point of view, it could work, even if it's not in the law. Very many civil law countries, though, have started to introduce dispute boards in legislation, and not only Latin American countries, but also Indonesia, for instance, and other parts of the world. So I think more and more it's a matter of how each country looks at it. I don't think there is a need because there is a contractual mechanism to cover it, but some authorities might feel safer if there is a regulation in the legislative system.
Okay, thank you. Lindy, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to this topic.
No, I'd absolutely agree with Andrew that adjudication in domestic adjudication or statutory adjudication in the UK has had an impact on dispute boards. I mean, I am aware of one or two dispute boards in the UK, but interestingly enough, they will come from companies who are used to that rather than domestic companies who have not had any experience of it. And I think it will only change when people genuinely see that the larger part of the dispute board role is the avoidance of disputes rather than the adjudication of disputes. And until then, I think within the UK, it will be hard to develop the dispute board process.
I agree with that, and I think that's the value of the conflict avoidance toolkit, which demonstrates the avoidance role of the dispute board as part of the process when there is a major project. And it may just be semantics, and we don't talk about dispute boards in the UK so much. We will talk about conflict avoidance panels. But new schemes are being started every day. I mean, just take an example across the Channel in Paris. There's a major Grand Paris development, so about 200 kilometers of tunnels and some 70 stations, and they've set up, my French is terrible, Comité de Résolution des Différends, CRD, CRD panels, where they have a two-step process. You make a recommendation on the merits of a dispute, and then you make a recommendation depending on what you've said on the first step in relation to quantum, and you do that 30 days from the referral. So it's a recommendation, so it's not a decision like you might have in adjudication, but it's an alternative. It's an alternative approach, and it's interesting to see how different countries, different organisations are approaching the challenges of avoiding disputes on major infrastructure projects. I see that the clock is ticking. One of the other issues that we wanted to briefly touch upon was costs. Again, I touched on this in our introduction, but the DRBF has recently collaborated with the European International Contractors and the SECA, the International Contractors Association, to produce a paper dealing with the effectiveness of dispute boards. And one of the things the paper does is contrast the research and anecdotal evidence about the value and effectiveness of dispute boards with the not so high levels of take up. And one of the reasons for this is costs. And there's a concern that dispute boards are perceived by some employers, project owners, some contractors as being too expensive. And this is one of the reasons why you quite often see the deletion of the dispute board clause in standard form contracts. And I wondered if anyone had any sort of views on that. Maybe Georgiana.
If we look at the all the studies that have been done, and even our dispute board manual, they talk about that 0.05% to 0.15% cost of projects. But remember that Region 1, so the US and Canada, or even the Australians, are talking about hundreds of millions worth of projects. So for them, doing the comparison, it's really a small amount. If we look more towards Region 2, and in particular of the RBF, so Europe, Africa, Asia, MENA region, where majority of the contracts are public contracts, or publicly funded. And generally that means smaller value if we talk about grants and loans from LDBs, 2 million, 5 million, 20 millions. Then the percentage could be seen as much higher. But I will refer you back to the JICA study in 2015 that was published also by the DRBF Forum magazine, that was making a simple calculation for an average small contract for a term of 2 years, 3 visits per year, one dispute board member resident, and that will take us to one of the questions of in the Q&A. So a dispute board member resident in the country of the project, and the JICA cost was an approximation of 145,000. So if the project is 5 million, it's doable. It's not very expensive. If you consider the other calculations that are saying that costs strictly related to delay, without adding the additional costs of managing the disputes, your legal costs, your expert costs, and everything else could go to about 35% of the project in total. So I think it is worth it. And perhaps again going back to JICA, JICA is financing 100% of the costs with dispute boards, of the monthly retainer of the dispute boards in all their grants, but not in the loans, because public employers then will look at it and say, well, I'm happy to get it as a grant. You know, I'm happy to spend someone else's money and see if it works, which is good. You have the experience at least. But when it's about me paying back, they've met a reluctance of those public authorities in paying back the loans, especially the portions trying to cut as much as possible from the loan money. So I think here is a matter of experience and the results that they had in the past with dispute boards. So perhaps it's good to start with smaller projects via grants where you could actually experience and learn about the project, about dispute boards process and how to use them, how to select the dispute board members, how to work with dispute board members, how to select them depending on the type of the project that you need, and then working gradually from there. That's
no, I think that's right. And you contrast the costs of a dispute board with the costs of a contested adjudication in the UK, or the costs of a contested court case or arbitration, and then there is a huge difference. And as you say, it increases the importance of the conflict avoidance role of a board. If they're there at the beginning, are they able to help the parties work together to avoid a more formal dispute arising? But I don't know, Sian, if you have any comment about the costs.
Yeah, I think the difficulty we have is that very often we're trying to prove a negative. I'm giving the example of I had a client, and the project sort of came through COVID a bit. So there were some supply chain issues, and we managed to get to the end. There were no disputes in the strict sense of the word, and we got to the end and everyone was happy. And after all of that, the client said, you see, no disputes. We didn't need you after all. And you just want to pull your hair out. You needed me. Do you have no disputes because we were here? And, how do you prove something that didn't happen? And I think that's why the data, that KCL, having the data is important, and the surveys that KCL does is very important, because it allows us to demonstrate the value with figures. Because the only other way a party is going to know if a DAB has provided value is with their personal experience. And if they haven't had the experience of it going horribly wrong, then they don't necessarily see the value as compared to when they have used it. And then when it goes horribly wrong, they're so traumatized by the experience, they don't want to have any association with any of it at all. So I think that's something that we have to get better at sort of demonstrating with the data that, it does work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit, Ramsey said, it's a mix of the anecdotal evidence and the cold hard facts of the academic research to try and do that. I don't know, Lindy, if there's any comment you wanted to add.
No, I really agree with all that's been said, and it's just persuading people that is the reality. There's a comment in one of the boxes about multiple adjudications as an example in the UK. More and more we see projects which go wrong and they're referred to adjudication 4, 5, 6 times. When you add up the costs of taking these to adjudication, they are way, way more than a dispute board would be, who would hopefully be able to manage these in such a way that you did not get the conflict that leads to adjudication. So it's again, it's a work in progress, but it's so important.
Yeah, Andrew, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Just a couple of points. There was a point from Wasim about informal assistance costs and whether if one of the parties didn't agree that the DAB should spend time and so therefore invoice, would the DAB then have a poor opinion of the party that was saying, you know, don't spend the money on this? And I would just say I doubt it. That probably wouldn't be at the front of their minds. They probably wouldn't say they didn't want to spend money, so they're bad people and we're going to decide against them. What they would probably think is, if one party says that there's something we should look at, you know, there may be something we should look at, and so that our job is conflict avoidance. But if they're just told no, you can't, that might raise other issues about whether or not they've been persuaded that the DAB is useful, a communication point, but I wouldn't say it would lead to bias. So, and I say that because DB members, as far as I know, they're trying to do the right thing. You know, they're professionals. They work very hard. They stay up late and get up early and travel around the globe and do all sorts of things. And they're trying to do the right thing, not. And that, you know, that would be a normal thing to be told you can't do this because we just don't want to for some reason.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. And I think your comment's been echoed by a comment by Pablo in the chat, which I think highlights very, very neatly the value of conflict avoidance, and actually saying we need to shift from avoidance in the sense of reacting, but to prevention as characterized by a proactive approach and the full involvement of DB members in identifying potential conflicts earlier in the project. And I think that's quite a neat summary of, you know, the value of the dispute avoidance function or conflict avoidance function of a dispute board, but also the principles of the underpin the conflict avoidance coalition. I'm conscious we are rapidly approaching the end of our hour, and in time-honoured fashion, I don't know if each of you have like a little comment you might like to make to wrap things up, perhaps starting with Sean.
Yeah, no, it's been an engaging discussion. I think the beauty of dispute resolution across the board is that it's intended to deal with the multiple of issues that arise. And I think if you use the right tool for the right problem, then you're always going to get a good result. So it's always a matter of just thinking about how can we work the dispute board or the conflict prevention or the, you know, quick adjudication to help the respective projects.
Yes, thank you. Andrew?
Summarizing, is it worth it? Yes.
Perfect. Georgiana?
Well, I would like to go back to the cost of avoidance, break the bank, or smart investment. And my answer would be smart investment, especially if you look at it as a project insurance and compare with everything else that costs you a lot of money and doesn't give you the benefit of this avoidance and prevention.
Great, thank you. And Lindy?
What I would say is, for those who haven't been involved in dispute boards before, is that the next project that you begin, explore this as a possibility. There are so many ways it can be done. And I think if you're open to it and really explore it and get the right people onto the board, it is well worth it.
That's brilliant. And just leaves for me to thank Lindy and Georgiana and Andrew and Shan. Thank you very much for your contributions and the time and trouble you took in preparing for today's webinar. And thank you to Anne for her help in organising it. And, you know, look out for other events in UK conflict avoidance event. And thank you all very much for your participation and your questions and your comments. It's been much appreciated. So thank you and goodbye.